to really talk about, and people saw him speak in St. Louis last summer and said he did such a fabulous job, and he has a connection with JCPS, so we're so fortunate to have him here. And I'll let Brent, who knows him better than I do, tell us a couple sentences about him.
Sure, thank you. We worked a great deal. Oh.
I'm sorry, we're streaming it.
Oh.
Thank you. You can hold it, that's fine.
Well, thank you. We worked a great deal with Dr. Dolan here in JCPS during the time that we were involved with the GE Math Science Grant, because he worked on a consulting basis with GE on that initiative. And he has, I think his favorite thing to do, as I understand it, is to come in sort of at the behest of both the union and the management. And he's worked in private sector, public sector, and has done this work for literally decades and has the wisdom that comes with that experience. And I think he helps both entities find common ground and a common understanding of how to work together constructively. So we look forward to hearing from him on those topics.
Of indigestion here. Take it easy. Well, my name is Pat Dolan, and I do have old friends here, board, management, and union. Just to kind of expand a little bit Brent's introduction, because it's, I think when I speak in a strange voice in many ways that many people have not heard, in the sense that for 40 years I've been a third party, almost always the outsider, and hired precisely because I'm an independent outsider. And I spent 20 years with big corporations, Ford and Boeing and John Deere and Goodyear and so forth, and their unions. And then 20 years ago, maybe more now, came back to my love of education. And that's what I've been writing about and working in for the last 25 years. And in general, here's what I'm always working, and you will see it. I'm hired because very often these large systems are very organic in the way they kind of fit together, and yet they don't very often operate as organic entities. And the real dilemma that at least I've made a living out of is kind of the separation and often even the alienation of the workforce from the enterprise for reasons that are interesting and that I'll play with just as a default. Kind of look at the country and what it looks like, and hence, if you do that, if you're trying to say, I want to bring the workforce back into deep kind of citizenship with the entity, and they are represented by an organized labor group, then you've got a double client almost immediately. That is to say, you must work both the union and the management's relationship and their own organizations as you make that journey of kind of inclusion and involvement and engagement of the workforce. It is a very common problem. It's a challenge for us for reasons I'm going to just touch on. And what I want to do then is, as you know, I came in and had a chance to just very briefly for a day or two talk to various leaders in various groups, if you will, at various levels and so forth. So I had a chance to spend a little time with the board, JCTA, the principals, the area superintendents, and the central office, just to somehow, otherwise I'm talking blind and somewhat irresponsibly. So I at least have a little context, and I'll talk a little bit about the context of what variation on the default model you have, if you will, and then talk finally, and most kind of, for me, the great interest is, what would you do if you had these kinds of challenges? Where would you go to begin to go deeper with respect to involvement, deep involvement in your goals, and how would you somehow work with the management, the administration, and the union to do that in a more kind of a more focused and powerful way. So that should be the hour, and then we'll have some time to kind of say I don't know what I'm talking about, which is quite possible, and or at least play with it a little bit. And then obviously my hope is that you have then all sorts of forums where you can go talk about it and so forth, both its truth and its, you know, where I missed the mark, because it's very easy for me to miss the mark. Last little kind of meta comment is that organizationally we think fairly primitively about organizations, in the sense that we tend to think cognitively about it. And by that I mean we think roles, responsibilities, and then we kind of set out our goals, and then we set out our measurements, and then much of our dialogue is around kind of as if the thing is a cognitive enterprise. It is, but it's about a third of its reality, and we operate as if we think it's almost the whole reality. Turns out that the reality is more like a family system, in which the real deep reality is the white space between us, the emotional valences, the way in which we live together, influences the roles, responsibilities, and all the cognitive structures and approaches. And that's very often in the literature, as we all know, called organizational culture, and that's, you know, what I studied at Harvard, I guess, these 45 years ago. So you'll find me talking, I'll draw, but I'll talk about the spaces between all of the entities, because they are extremely important in terms of being able to do the cognitive work. Otherwise, you know, I was taught by the genius and the father of family systems work, a fellow by the name of Bowen at Georgetown Medical School. And the way he would start the opening lecture to the young doctors there, and I was kind of in the middle of that group, he would walk out with 3 families, a mother, a father, an older daughter, and a younger son. And he would say to the 200 young MDs, he would say, well, here's the default, not his language, here's the default family structure, right? All right, there's a father, everybody sees everybody. So he would say, therefore they're all the same, to which the auditorium would say no. And he would say, how do you know that? And how are they different? Without knowing anything, how do you know that they're different? And of course, we all know, having grown in systems, that every relationship is infinitely complex, even in a dyad of a family, let alone a kind of a 4-person family. And then, in some senses, the extrapolation to organizational psychology is that metaphor, which is to say, this thing is glued together by weird things like trust, honesty, openness, truth-telling, and so forth. The things that you can hardly touch, but everybody lives the role of assistant superintendent, of principal, of teacher, and so forth, based on those realities. They are much more important than, in some senses, saying what your role is. It gives me nothing. I know where you fit in a diagram, and so forth. So, with that as background, that's kind of where I'll wander this evening. The first thing I'm going to talk about is just the generic model, because there are some pieces you know going in, or at least you have to be very wary of where those things are, and you should be surprised if somehow they've done a worse job or a better job with respect to it. So we are using, and I get to draw the thing I've been drawing for 45 years. I think I do. We are using an old ecclesiastical military model that's kind of at the core of the Western world. All right? We kind of organize ourselves in some sort of a hierarchy, and it probably is an old Roman military model, and then probably the Catholic Church got a hold of it for about 1,500 years and did nothing but deepen it, all right? In which there is enormous kind of control at the top. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, you know, and when you say that this guy represents God, you've got a fairly hierarchical system, all right? And so they, you know, when they go for it, they go for it. But the reason I talk about that is not because it's a history of either the Roman Catholic Church or the Roman army. This thing kind of infiltrates the way we organize complex work. It's just the way we start. Now, and I'm arguing, we do all sorts of things to try and move and to mitigate some of the bad downside part of it, but in general, we start there, all right? And and I don't mean just a person. We ordinarily have a top group, a command central, if you will. And the prejudice here, and it's a good one, is that you do, you know, for various reasons, you do strategy up here, all right? And then you have a group in the middle that does kind of tactics and an attempt to basically figure out what it is these folks wanted you to do. These folks live in the field, all right? They live and die with the troops. And so they have a real hard reality, all right, that they live with that somehow tries to translate this. And then you have folks who carry spears. And they're supposed to, you know, in the old model, they die on command, all right? They're supposed to go. So the prejudice there is strategy, tactics, implementation, pretty simple, all right? And the kind of assumption in there is, out of a military and an ecclesiastical model, deep loyalty throughout. If you're in there, you owe enormous fealty to this thing, to the point of running great risk and so forth. And that thing, if you think about our history, kind of at the end of the 20th and into the 21st century, this thing held. I grew up in World War II. My grandparents' house was, I was the oldest son of the oldest son. I was a little boy in my grandmother's house in Kansas City when 5 of her 6 boys were across Europe and Africa. And every day she wrote 5 letters out to this thing, and they were down in here and so forth. And until Vietnam, this thing really held for us. If you joined it, or in some senses you worked in a company, this thing was in some senses part of us, and we held on to it. I have a father-in-law who joined GE at the age of 23 and died at the age of 82, and he worked for GE, all right? There's a prejudice here around information that I just want to note with you. You don't want these guys to know much, not because you disrespect them, but because you lose them, all right? And when they get picked off with some of this data and information or this, you are exposed in a certain kind of way, and so are they. So the less they know, in some senses, the safer they are and the safer the organization is. So there's a prejudice of holding knowledge here. So I'm threading, just beginning to thread, high loyalty, real high control, control of information for the good of the enterprise and for the good of the people in it, and so forth. When we get more sophisticated in terms of our work, we add a piece that's really interesting. We add a piece that basically says, I need some specialists in here, because this is very complex. And so I add, you know, certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, in both corporate but public sector, private and public, we add specializations, and we certainly in public education at this point into the 21st century, we have these. These are all PhDs. They're in the room. They speak tongues, and we need them. We need them because they understand a special piece of it. They understand special ed. They understand finance. They understand math curriculum in a way that nobody else does. They spend kind of middle part of their life learning that. So you need kind of what I call, and a lot of people call, kind of the silos, if you will. You know, this is the same for John Deere. I mean, the engineering, you know, if you look at somebody stronger in engineering than they are in marketing, somebody is stronger in finance like Ford than they are in design. But in general, you get, and it is never perfectly balanced, or hardly ever. One of these things brings with it a special culture to the corporation or the organization in general. So here we are with this, and the danger with this, the slippage here, so I'm going to add another X up here, the slippage here is that you must keep these people together, because if you don't, and by keeping them together, you've got to meet with them regularly to make sure that their language comes out as a common kind of focus. And if you don't, then the field officers have to pick up spaghetti, all right? They've got to face it. It comes to them in individual silos, and they can't put it together. That's not their expertise. They'll put it together because they have to, but they don't integrate it well. It has to be integrated here. Has to be a common message with these things integrated into them. If it is not, you get enormous slippage here. Enormous slippage. And these men and women, they're kind of at the over there, all right, have to translate this thing day in and day out here. And it's a fascinating piece because this thing is usually kind of tight loose, if you will, in the sense that you ought to be real clear about this and how you measure it. You ought to have field people in positions that you have no idea about who are smart enough, skilled enough to basically take the strategy, and tactics by definition means they're smart enough to adapt it and deal with that, all right? If in some senses, so they allow this world of just hard concrete variability and these goals to somehow swing and work. This is a very difficult position. You live in the middle. If I ask these men and women across the country in any enterprise, are you part of the high command or are you part of the field delivery? Their answer is yes. It should be yes. All right. But there are always sacrifices to be made. And if there are sacrifices or trade-offs to be made, the good ones always make it in this direction. All right? And the reason is they have to keep, the real reason is they live and die here. That's ultimately, all right? Now, if you get somebody who always chooses this, it means that in some senses they're trying to get here and this is of secondary importance. And so it's it is a wonderful position. The thing swings there. They are key. When I come back to you and your enterprise, this thing is really interesting right now around where the loyalty and fealty, if you will, is. All right? And so I'll just tease you with that, all right? This group, well, let me swing back. When you do this, and this gets more complicated, the more complicated this gets, both in the field and the work itself, so both. And notice the real problem here is this is a stable model. This is built for stability. It's just built for kind of pushing together and so forth. We've lived through so many centuries now in which this thing gets warp speed. And it really does struggle for crispness, but mostly alacrity. It is not, by nature, it is not alacritous. You have to work like hell to get this thing to basically respond at the speed of the world today, the learner of today, the challenges for the learner, and so forth. You've really got to go after it. All right. The last piece is that when it gets, or second last piece is when it gets real complicated out here, this thing tries to get a shorthand so it knows what's happening to it. And when it does that, it can't measure all the qualitative pieces that give it the deep reality that's happening out here. It will go, in general, and I'm going very fast here, it goes to short-term numbers. All right, and that's a late kind of accretion to it, but it's by the 20th century, it's clear that that's the way we manage. Vietnam, again, in the military model, is a fascinating example. The thing is so complex, and when Westmoreland gets a hold of it with his boss, they basically go to a corporate language, and the corporate language is incredible. The literature out of Vietnam is fascinating with respect to this model because the model is kind of coming apart. But the language of Vietnam is body counts. And so if you were out here, if you were a captain here, this thing constantly called and said, how's it going? Give me your answer in numbers. And the numbers were very simplistic, all right? Count them, count you, and phone it in, all right? Now, the danger is that if you have different quality data here, this thing can't handle it very well. Unless you've got really good relationships, you can't say the second sentence, which is, the body counts are terrific in my favor, but I'm losing. Because that's a qualitative kind of comment, all right? So you got to pay special attention to this. Good, thank goodness, all right. Good, nice choice. We could be down in the sunken, right, yeah. So the last piece is the hardest piece to say, But it is, in some senses, it comes with this turf. It's been our challenge from time immemorial, and it's really been our challenge since certainly the early 1900s and Industrial Revolution. And that is that we have all sorts of caring people in these things up here, in these administrative positions. And when these people are told that they're responsible for the enterprise and its quality, and they are told that, we train them, we expect that, and so forth. The danger is what that translates in their mind and in their skills around what they do with that responsibility. And the danger is that you get all sorts of people who work 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, trying to be responsible for this enterprise's day-to-day work. And when you wake up doing that, all right, there's no question that they work like mad on it and they send the message, I'm responsible for it, where is it, how is it going, and so forth. The danger is that the message to these men and women over a long period of time, day after day, all right, if you spend 10, 15, 20, 25 years in here, the danger is that that behavior and that message says just the opposite of what we believe. But it doesn't. It says to them that somehow these people are responsible for their work. And the subtext of that is even more deadly. It says, I'm responsible for your work. We'd never say this, and we don't believe it, but this is the effect of it. At least I argue in my, just after 40 years of doing this, the message is that they're stupid, they don't care, and they can't be trusted. Now, none of us believe that, but the danger is that if you keep managing layer after layer like that, they say eventually, well, it doesn't look like I'm responsible for this thing. It looks like that guy and that woman and so forth are, so I wish them Godspeed. All right? I hope they're good at it, all right, because it's their issue, not mine anymore. And I say that because there is a deep alienation that occurs over long periods of time, not based on bad people at all, just the opposite, that eventually everybody, there's a displacement of the responsibility of the work here, and we walk around saying, why is that? How did that happen? These people are caring people everywhere else in their life. But if you try and be caring in here, it might mean that today you stand up and you say, I don't think we're doing it really well over here. Well, in a military model, that's insubordination. That's not helpful. Or the dangers it gets translated that way. And so eventually they stop. They just stop. So you get this displacement of responsibility in very responsible people and so forth. So when you walk in eventually with a beautiful strategic plan in which you are talking about children in deep growth, all right? You cannot be surprised if they look at you and say, I hope you're good at doing this, all right? And now I'm saying that without any data, just the default deal here is that this thing is enormously suspicious and so forth. So now just hold my favorite model, my top-down kind of non-listening model. The last piece, I guess, is the alienation at the bottom and what that does to the folks at the top trying to figure out how it's going. Because in many ways, they won't tell you anymore. You can build systems, and you can track whatever you can track, but they know, and in some senses, they will not stand up and say it. And you say, that's disloyal. How could they do that? Why would you do that after the 5th year? I mean, how thick would you be? All right, to keep standing up and getting whacked. That's just, so they stop. So the danger is that this group up here is desperate for knowing really how it is. They ask questionnaires, they do everything to just figure out where it is. You'd like to be able to shout down the pike, how's it going? And they tell you. All right? It's Patton walking the tanks at night. Because he's a good old boy, and he's got a 5th of whiskey and a cigar, and he says, how's it going? And in their lovely language and his, they tell him, with none of these folks in between. All right? The last piece is the union. The organized labor group, in some senses, organizes off of the alienation. I don't know how else to say it. All right? These people are all alone over against a fairly powerful thing. I mean, I'm making the case for them, but they didn't arise out of, out of the sea. this thing in some senses says, I need something as strong as this to deal with this. And ultimately, that's the beginning of some attempt to say, well, politically, if we can get this legally, we need one of them. All right? This will help us, and so forth. All right? And, you know, it's what I call, well, there's a second piece that happens. You know, when it happens in education, it happens in the 60s, right? Late. But when it happens, we only have one model. In fact, I just was writing a chapter on kind of the early birth in Wisconsin and so forth. The NEA was organizing Milwaukee. And the people they sent in to talk about the union were 3 UAW leaders, all right? And I say that because that's my bridge. The model we have for organizing labor groups is an industrial model. We took it right off the industrial floor, and the legislators did the same thing. This is negotiable, this is not, this the union can talk about, this they cannot, these are management rights, and so forth. So, and they do a really, you know, for the next 40 years, they organize it in the area that they're allowed to, pay benefits, working conditions, but working conditions kind of narrowly defined for the most part. There's kind of back and forth on that, all right? All right? And they do it in such a way that they pull this profession, you know, and they pull it dramatically in terms of pay and benefits. All right? But that leads us into some issues I'll talk about later, but the problem is it's an industrial model. And the main problem with the industrial model of union management is that it's not a professional model, and these are professionals. And professionals basically need time all over the place to think. What they do is think. That's what a professional does. They do work, but they do work in form. So if I walked in Boeing, and tonight we were talking with the engineers at Boeing, and I would say, I think I can get you an hour and a half every week to think. Are you with me? They would look at me like I was out of my mind. I mean, the room would be engineering union leaders and so forth. Say, what we do is think. We also draw and we also design, but we think. This thing was organized as an industrial model in which we beg, borrow, and squeeze it to get an hour and a half of reflective time. And the reason is that time off a welding machine is lost time, non-productive time, and I get kicked in the teeth and elsewhere, all right, on my budget because they're not welding. And so it kind of carries over here. All right? So we're at an enormous disadvantage. We all know the data. If you laid out the 15 major success stories in terms of education and how much time those professionals have to think, and you start at the top, we're not even in the top 12. All right? And the world-class ones are at 50%. Thoughtfulness, reflection, working together, looking at the kind of the research and so forth. Globally? Yes. Yeah, globally. The closest, I don't even know what the closest is. Certainly in North America, 2 Canadian provinces would be in the top 12 at about, 12%, something like that. So there's a bunch of pieces here, all right? But stay with me on the old prejudice, which is to say, in the industrial model, the dummy with the tie gets paid to think, all right? I get paid to do what I'm told, leave me alone. When I walk in a Ford plant, the first conversations are fascinating in 1970 because they say, what do you mean be responsible for quality? That's his job, not mine. I weld. All right? All right. So with the time issue comes also the fact that, well, that's not my issue. All right? So we've got wonderful professionals here with enormous skills organized in a certain kind of really truncated way. All right? I've been using lately Bonhoeffer, the great Lutheran theologian out of Nazi times. He had a wonderful kind of phrase he called cheap grace, in which cheap grace is in some senses where you say you're a Christian because you believe, and he was vehement, and very powerful around saying, no, you're a Christian when you do the hard lifting of discipleship. Well, I say to my I'm the only, I think, I'm very proud of this, the outsider at the NEA in terms of their future, all right? It's cheap unionism to live off of the alienation and not fight for the deep professional responsibility. So we've got a double responsibility. We got to figure out a management process that allows them to do that and learns how to manage that way. And they've got to make the journey of stepping up to a shorter route that says that's not our issue. It is their issue. It's a professional's issue. And we have to step up to it. But we have to have time, space, and the trust to make the journey. All right? If I were to say that's the sentence that I believe is the journey for the next 30 years in this country around public education, that's the journey. All right? And, but that's my shorthand for the default. So it's a management model, you know, with its characteristics, a union history that basically comes in at the end of it, especially in public education, uses the model that it's got, uses it as best it knows it can, given the legislature. It can't move even if it wants to. Even if you've got leadership that wants to move in there, you can't move. Management responsibilities, rights, and so forth. Yeah, and one last thing, of course, you know, when we get under the torque, you know, under the push, look where we went in terms of whether we were winning or losing in terms of educating children. We go to short-term numbers. It's not, nobody thought that you know, that a standardized test told us everything, not even close. But when you're looking at millions of children, all right, and No Child Left Behind, you know, I'm not a kind of conspiracy guy. I think they looked up and said, we're going to test how many children, how often, in how many things. And they said, well, we can only do 2. All right, and there's this million with 4th, 8th, 10th grade. All right, still it's overwhelming. What can we measure? Let's measure this. All right. And then you have to be careful, because even if you set the policy here, everybody then translates into loyalty, I guess. They want tests, all right? And then this thing just starts to multiply the measurements, so that we get to the, you know, the hysteria of 2 years ago where we're testing, you know, we're, in New York, we're using 15% of our time, instructional time, to test. So it got away from us a bunch of ways. But it's a short-term numbers piece. Complexity, measure it the quickest way you can, the easiest way. Okay. So there's our lovely model, and there's not much else I want to say to it, except that now I'm going to play with it a little bit. So Jefferson County, you know, you do some things really well. I have 3 or 4 things that I would say tell you, in some senses, where the default was operative, and where you've actually done really good job around it to heal it and to move it. You've got the classic union management board. I work with maybe, I don't know, 25 maybe a year in some depth. I call this boundary 1, all right? And I'm going to run around this now. I call boundary 2 just because I need some lingo to keep me clear, all right, around kind of where I'm talking. So the relationship, the board, union, and management, all right, is boundary 1, and it's huge because in some senses this sets the tone. It gives permission to move one day or another, and everybody here reads the tone. It's a hierarchical system, whether we like it or not, and everybody wants to somehow say, I'm with it, I'm with it. All right? We've got our top management here, all right? And we've got some really strong people here, and historically we've had really strong people, you know. And you're constantly rebuilding this, and so don't forget, I call this the strategy, the CEO and the top reports at least. This is the work, all right? And the work gets done in the field, and boundary 3 is the principal. Boundary 2 is the instruction skill. It's the teacher, support staff, and so forth here. And, of course, you know, after Ted Sizer and so forth, you have to basically say there's a second knowledge worker here. All right? And the second knowledge worker undergoes the same journey as the first knowledge worker. And let me do a little riff on this. If you teach for more than 3 successive years after the age of 5, in a caring fashion in which you give a message that you do not intend intend to give to the third graders and the fourth graders and so forth, if you give them a message that you are responsible out of deep caring for their learning, at about 5th, 6th grade is the sheer point in which they say, I wish you Godspeed. I know it's a tough journey to get me to learn, but I know you're up to it, all right? I know you got it. They don't come that way. They don't come that way. But if you basically kind of message that somehow they've got to get it done for you, the displacement and the alienation is profound, all right? And I would say one other thing. It is a deep displacement for a child. That is to say that her work is somehow my issue. But if you are a certain kind of child, a minority child, who's basically very cautious about anybody threatening anything around my identity and taking it away, all right, then you are super cautious. You are the canary and you will catch that by 3rd grade. 4th grade, you'll hear a message, has nothing to do with learning. It has to do with somehow you taking over my life, and I will fight you to the death on that. It is an early message. It is very powerful, and they hear it like that. All right, but I would say in general, the alienation around the world here, unless you've got a whole bunch of other adults out here saying, I don't want to hear that, you're responsible. If she's not going home to a family in which is saying, you know, this is your work. I don't care what you think, all right? If you're not somehow pushing that against that other culture, they have a very difficult time holding deep responsibility for the work. It's very hard in that model. Notice the contradiction. I'll come back to it. But the contradiction that we don't know how to teach anywhere, that's not true. We do, but we miss it a lot. Which is to say, the way you create deep quality, if you're responsible for it, is to give it away. I don't know how else to say it. You have to create a place, a culture, in which you say, this is not my work, this is your work, but I will create a place in which you can do it. And I will give you support to do it well. And I'll remove barriers, read my lips. My role as a leadership person, wherever I am, teaching, principals, is to create a place where you can lead, where you can take it, where you can be full, powerful. We don't teach that in them very much, you know. And if you look at our journey as parents, it's the journey. It's counterintuitive. They're sacred, and so you say, all right, I'm responsible for them, and that's deadly for them, because in some senses they never learn it for themselves. They never learn that it's their journey, not yours. You know, you watch young parents. First kid, they grab him before he falls down. When he goes like this, they go, all right? And it turns out in the second or third that he has to fall down in order to learn how to walk. And all they do is they kind of lean towards each other on the third one and say, do you suppose she's too close to the cliff or not? You know? I mean, there's an enormous growth in our ability to understand that you have to give it away. You have to trust that. Okay. So boundary 2 and 2A is the action. And, of course, that's where I'm really concerned. All right? And how we keep that power and that strength in here. 4 is where I'm going to start, because it's fascinating. 4 is not a person, it's not a role, and so forth. 4 is the information system. So stay with me just a minute, all right? But if you build the goals and the responsibilities and the measurements in such a way that everybody understands that they had input, they believe in it, and they hold themselves responsible to it, this thing is the glue. All right? They're not doing it for her. She's not doing it out of fear of them. They're not doing it out of fear of the board. Everybody's doing it because it's their enterprise, their goals, and their measures. This has everything to do with a high-trust organization, and you have to work like mad over against the hierarchy to make it authentic. I don't know how else to say it. You can do it, but you've got to work it. You've got to work it. And I call this group 5. I'll come back to them. These are the specialists, the PhDs, the central office group. And this is a whole other conversation for another day, but I will say that I've had some wonderful conversations with David over the last week or so around it. This is the external group. This is the community in all of its iterations. These are taxpayers, these are parents, these are the whole the whole ball of wax. And in general, you know, strange to say, but follow me just a little bit, this model tends to see the customer as a necessary bother or an enemy. You say, that can't be. They know they exist for it. Yes, they do. All right? But negative data is dangerous in here. And lo and behold, these people have the possibility of bringing unsolicited negative data in here. There's slippage and they yell. And these people say, close the door, build the wall. Hold it. The fascinating piece, I walked in Ford and they basically said, if we could just build trucks and not have to deal with the people who buy them. And you say, what do you mean? Well, because they're all over the place. They do stuff we didn't design it to do. They complain like mad and so forth. It costs us money. They're a pain in the rear, all right? They are, and they keep you straight. You got to want it. You got to go get it. All right? It's the reason you exist, but it's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive. It's dangerous. All right? So the first principle of systems is that it's all one. So if you mess with any piece of it, you mess with the whole thing. You touch it here, it moves. You touch it here, it moves. So you set out a year ago to build a strategic plan, to build a kind of a new four. And it's rather lofty, and it's rather aspirational. All right? It's about deep learning and so forth and so on, and it's done in good faith, and the board leads and so forth and so on. But if you look at where it is, it's your key, it's your future. But if you said, oh yes, and it all happens down here, all right, you're in trouble. You all know you're in trouble because these folks down here feel that this right now is not theirs, it's somebody else's. Now that's classic, it isn't a deep. It's just that's where you are, and you have to think about it in terms of the default. It takes enormous work to build this with such authenticity that the whole or the majority owns it. All right? I'll come back to a beautiful piece that Fullen's got in a new book that says it so cleanly, but I just want to highlight it. Boundary 4 is the glue. It has everything to do with the whole system having confidence in it, and if it comes like this, or if it comes a little bit outside in, as yours did a little bit, all right, this group is going to be very suspicious. First of all, because they're very suspicious in general, as I've tried to lay out, for reasons that are very clear and should be, all right? And if it comes a certain kind of way, it just locks up. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Second, you do have a layer, a really interesting layer, all right? Usually everybody leaves a little mad at me, so you know, I'm the union manager, everybody, so bear with me, all right? But you have this thing that talks about deep learning, but you've got some really strong people who are in these schools every day asking a little different feel for the principles. They're asking short-term numbers, benchmark data, they're driving it. As they should, because we lose jobs around that. We're getting torqued that way. Kentucky's where it is, and so forth, all right? So the area superintendents, who are my major linkage here, all right? And actually, these people have a good deal of confidence in them. Trust them, like them. I ask every which way. They're accessible and so forth. My problem is what they're doing, all right? What they're doing in terms of what you're saying is a real issue. Here's the wonderful dichotomy that you've kind of isolated, and I think you got to work it now, which is to say there's a school of thought in education that says, you know, and Alan Young is probably the stronger guy in the country around this, you engage the whole child. And if you engage the whole child, the learner, somehow you get her to so that she starts to move, and eventually all of the issues of whether she can or cannot do it, all right, are solved because she's got it and she's driving and you've engaged her. We got another model in here, very, very true as well, that says if they can't do the minimal reading and writing, why are we talking about deeper learning, all right? I got to get them to the first, second, third, and fourth level so they can actually make the journey. Tell me which of those is right. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. But we don't have a place where we say yes, yes. How are we working it? I don't believe. All I would say is we need work to baptize this thing, these folks here, and these folks here, and these folks here, and so have got to start engaging these folks on what it really means. All right. If we don't do that, this is going to stay there like a rock, and so forth. So I would say that this, in some senses, at least gives me a way to say, oh, this is where the thing's kind of off a little bit and gives me some answers to certain things. Now, go back to cheap unionism. If you do this in a certain kind of way, all right, then in some senses you create enough dissonance down here. You know, there's always a principle or so forth that causes them a little dissonance, and that's what they hear. But if you're doing this a certain kind of way, and so forth, and the danger is, of course, that the union moves in behind here, and it's a danger only in the sense that that's their job. Their job is to hear this thing creak and come to a stop, and then talk about it, represent it, and so forth. What you want, this is a professional union. You can't move this without this union. And if in some senses politically they can't move, even if they want to, they can't move because of this thing locked up a certain kind of way, then we're into a second kind of triangle. We have to somehow provide some place here where this and this group can make a journey strong enough that this group gets a different kind of message, and this union leadership is free to keep moving. This is a political enterprise. They cannot outstrip the attitudes here. So you look at how fascinating that is. You have to move this a little bit in order to move this enough that this can move in again. All right? And if you don't have that kind of skill set to basically open, this thing just stays where it is, and it's easy and it's correct to just stay here. You know, I laugh. Lisa pushes me a lot on this. But in general, the prejudice of these two organizations when they live together is management hears all the good stuff, because you want the boss's boss to hear it's going well. And the union hears all the bad stuff, because that's their job. All right? So when I go in, all right, to places like this, you say, how's it going? And this group says, oh, God. And then you say to this group, how's it going? We're lined up, the thing is sailing, and you say, yes, but, all right, yes, but. I mean, that made me a living for 45 years, all right? You sit down with both of them, you say, let me just listen to this thing, and then we'll sit here together and we'll figure out how crazy both of you are. In the sense that, they've got one piece of reality and they're on it, all right? And they got plenty of data for it. All right, plenty of data. Every day the phone rings, all right? Every day the reports come in. And you have to, so the first issue is to say, do we have any place where we actually listen to the truth of this thing together? Now you'll hear again kind of how I'm going to try and spin this a little bit later, but I think you have to have the same view of reality, and then you have to have a place to learn, because if this doesn't move slowly, your middle management's not going to move if the management's not doing this. This group, the reps, are not going to move unless this group sees it, and this group can't outstrip this group. So it's a very interesting, kind of convoluted, but doable kind of piece. So now I'll hold that lovely picture. And go with me to a lovely new book by Michael Fullan. Very simple book, as usual, for Fullan, you know. But he's got this thing. And I spent 3 days with him just talking about my work, his work, and so forth lately. You know, about 2 months ago. He's got a book called Coherence. And the thrust of Coherence, he studied what he thinks are the best 40 districts in the world. Right? And he would argue the following. They almost all have what he would call, and it's quite a chapter or so, but the stuff that I do, if you will, the stuff we've been talking about. You must build collaborative structures, processes, and culture in order to do this work at a high level. And so there's a lot of ways you can do this, and we'll talk about it and discuss it. But basically, what do you do? You know, what's the fodder that you put into this kind of mixer? Well, his argument is just exactly what we've been talking about, all right? The goals, this is your strategic plan, you know, and then stuff that falls out of it, and the measurements. But notice what he's saying. In order to build this with integrity and authenticity, you have to do it this way. All right? You have to build this in such a way that everybody believes in it, owns it, and then the harder journey still is to figure out what it means. It's going to be quite a journey here for us to decide what a child looks like doing deeper learning. But it's worth the journey, especially if you're also testing along the way, not over-testing, so that you've got both views and so on. But that's the work, because then everybody starts to own this thing in a certain, and we got to tell the truth about it in a certain kind of way. But the real insight that I think he leaves us with is, what's the infinite kind of trajectory of this profession? That is to say, what will pull us higher forever? And it is not curriculum, and it is not assessment, for goodness sakes. It is pedagogy. It's the engagement of child every day, all of them different, with the curriculum, and kind of measuring to know how I'm doing. But this is what you want, and this is your thinking time. It isn't that I'm doing it, it's that I'm doing it and I have a place to reflect with master teachers, with other people who are teaching the same child. But this is the reflective time, and this is the professional work. And this will drive you then constantly. But his frame in coherence, in the book Coherence, is to say, if you do this top down and do this top down, and you never get here, because you can't make them do that, all right? If you don't do it in this kind of a fashion, in some senses, it's a fairly hollow journey. It's just a hollow journey. And the profession has this strange dichotomy, which is it is desperate to be reflective, highly qualitative, and respected, all right? But in some senses, it's got a lot of language that says, I don't know whether I want to do that heavy lifting. The real leadership in the union across the country is to say, you bet we're going to do it. It's our work. And just a quick side note that Brent and I deal with every month at NEA, if we don't do that, the next 3 million teachers in the next 4 years are saying to us 1,000 ways, I need help here. And when we ask them, it's no secret, when we ask them, is the union helpful here? The data is really tough. We have to claim that territory to be a union in 5 years. All right? So it's in our self-interest, but it's in the interest of the professional wants that. If we give them a safe place where it's not, where they're not terrified to step in there and look at themselves, look at each other, and so forth. If you create blame and deep kind of punitive language around this, I mean, the last 5 years has been a disaster on this, you know, just a disaster around the way we framed the measurement issue and the pedagogy. I think I was talking to Dina earlier. We were 3 to 4 years ago, we were this close to a country that was going to have a common curriculum, kind of high, engaging, you know, got a little truncated, but in general, we started to move that way. And we had 2 tests, you know, they were a little narrow, but they were going to give us at least some sign of how we were doing. We're going to fold them into one. And we were basically going to say to the teaching profession, I think, figure out kind of how you should be evaluated. We'll work with you, but we're going to get highly qualitative kind of and quantitative data. And so we were this close. And of course, in 3 years, and I think some of us were in Arnie's office, I told David, we used to go in there every 3 months and say, stop, slow down. You're way ahead of where this thing is, and it's going to lock up on you. So what we have today is New York lost for the next 8 years. Florida lost for the next 8 years. If you tried to build this kind of a structure around any of this in New York right now, you'd have to be one of the apostles to make that happen. It's impossible. California basically stiff-armed him, said we're not going to measure anybody. And we sure aren't going to evaluate anybody based on data that we don't know has anything to do with pedagogy. And then, you know, that good old ex-Jesuit Jerry Brown gets some money, big money, and he gives a piece of legislation that says, here's some money, you have to spend it collaboratively, start working on the common curriculum. So up and down California, all the teachers, the CTA, who's notorious for not being terribly cooperative, is working deeply on the curriculum, common assessments to figure out kind of how we are and so forth. We've got a very trusted former superintendent working with a group of CTA leaders and others around what a qualitative evaluation might be. The place is calm, it's collaborative, we're working on the right issues in a qualitative way, and the reason is they said we're not going to do any of this. All right? And all I'm saying is you have to do this. Now you could go back. All I'm really saying, and I'm going to talk about in a minute how to do that, but I think you've got to go back and get this thing with some work here. And your real goal is to get here. And maybe that's the right place for me to just say, here's the way I would do it. And then we talk. We talk a little bit. All right. Notice that this thing is very complex. It's not easy. And you can't do it by fiat, but you can do it, and you basically have to, I think, at least a therapeutic model that would help. And I mean therapeutic in the sense that I borrowed a lot of it from. I think what I would do if I were trying to change the management and the union, slowly to do some work together around something that they thought was important that would make a difference, all right, in terms of the deep long-term work, all right? And notice what's up for grabs here. I mean, again, David is a powerful voice in this. We have to do this in order, this thing has to save these children, and the saving of these children saves this community. It's that, I mean, if you look at Detroit, if you look at where Milwaukee's going, if you look at St. Louis, if you look at Kansas City, everybody who loses this public school system loses the community. It becomes a shell. This is the glue. This is the Commonwealth. So if you do this and you want to do it well, you have to have a strategy that the union has to learn and listen and move. The management has to do so. But the real issue is they've got to do it together. All right? Not something they're terribly gifted at. Nor do we have structures to do it very, you know. We sometimes usually have a trusted labor person in here who deals with the union. They do problem solving day to day. They do it really well, because they've got people on both sides who can do it. But this is a different kind of work. This is, in some senses, a kind of a, you have to have a place that has a common view of the world, and that means you've got to create a place where you can get it. I would create some sort of a district management committee here, a structure. This is what, all right, with some leadership out of the central office and so forth. I'd put 2 or 3 lead principals on there just because I need the field presence in there. I would ask 20 good schools to volunteer to come with me on the first wave. And I'd ask them to build some sort of a site leadership team if they didn't already have one. By then, I need union reps, I need teachers, I need counselors, I need, in high schools, I need some children and so forth. Some sort of a place that says, all right, I don't need this thing. I don't want more management people or people managing people, just the opposite. And then I've got the reflective time. So let's just presuppose that I've got PLCs down here. And I'll do this really briefly. What you're trying to do is you're trying to build a listening and learning organization that heals itself. The first thing you have to do is heal the bottom. Right? And by that I simply mean if it has been told over a long period of time that you don't want to hear its ideas and you don't value them, the first thing you have to do is to say to them, I need you. And so I would say to them, take deep learning in these 20 schools, and I'm asking you to step up and at least 2, maybe 3 of your PLCs a month. I don't know whether it's against the contract, but I'm just going to say what I think is a full model. Ask them, invite them to use their reflective time to start talking, thinking, and working on what it would mean for us to do deep, deep learning with these children, their children. Now they're, you know, but if we had 20 of these, we'd be kind of, and we'd go across the system so we could get a bunch of different kinds of learners and so forth and so on. But I need I need some place where I'm going to say, we are going to try this. We're going to drive it off of the professional's voice and skill. And I am going to send a message of respect, empowerment, and learning from them. All right? Now, everybody's still managing, all right? But we're going to do this counter piece. And here I listen. Every week or two, I ask them to come talk to me about what they're learning, about how to engage these children in deeper learning. And the first thing this collaborative group does is it talks to the school. It says, we're into it. Chemistry's doing this. Biology's doing this in a high school. And this is what we're learning about what doesn't work. Tell the truth. And this is what's working. And this is inching along. And we just did a benchmark, and it looks like maybe, all right, and so forth. You have to broadcast. You have to listen and learn and broadcast. It's what you do at the Sunday table with your own children. You have to listen to them where they are in their journey. You can't tell them. Right? And then you have to give it back to them with a taste of the values that you believe in, that are the glue for that family. That's broadcast in my language. That says, this is who we are. I know you're a big shot and you're class president, the junior, but how are you doing? All right? All right? And you keep telling them, this is who we are, this is where we're going, this is how you're doing. If you're in trouble, yell. And the same thing here. Of these 20 schools, build a place where the union and management come together to say, what are we learning about the strategic plan? I don't care about the strategic plan, neither do you. What you care about is this thing moving towards engagement of children in deep learning, truth-telling about where we are with respect to it, and ultimately this thing starts to own it. And when they own it, and you're in a position where the union and management can learn how it's going, the union gets some space down here to start moving in the direction that we need, and so does the management. We have to teach skills as we go. You know, I understand the size of this place. We got to get there. But I would start with something I thought I could swallow, all right, to learn this and so forth. And again, kind of both management and union pushed me to say, well, say something concrete around this. I think that you have to somehow make real and authentic that vision. It's really a good vision, all right? But you have to do it in such a way, you can't talk to them anymore about this. That's not what this is about. It's not cognitive journey. It's a journey in which you say, if we were going to do that, what could you tell me about how? And you say that to the professional. They cannot, in some senses, resist that. That is the question that they die to have somebody say. It is what every good principal does out there. And the last piece that I would say to you is in terms of kind of loyalty, it's just fascinating. This thing is really strong, at least the early sampling. The loyalty here to certain principles is quite strong, quite strong. The loyalty, if I don't have somebody here they're loyal to, then they're loyal to JCTA, but they are not loyal to this right now. They're scared of it, or they're distrustful, or they think it's doing something that doesn't have anything to do with them. We have to make this a we. And the way I would do it is to ask them. This changes. Notice how complex it is. It is, yes, about our learning from them. And yes, it is a learning together and a creating a common reality that allows this thing to move. But it's actually healing. It takes a system that somehow says, they've been doing it to me, and says, we're going to change that, especially at the deepest level around your work. You are the authority. Help us learn with you. And if you got it moving, then you could move it laterally more quickly as you learned how to do this. I wanted to at least stop there with enough time that we could chew on it, react to it a little bit, because I've made quite a journey here. I mean, I basically said, I think here are the kind of the dilemmas of the old model. I think you've got some variations on that. I hope I didn't offend anybody. I pray that I didn't. At least not too badly, and somehow at least puzzled out a concrete way to kind of. There's maybe a bunch of ways to do this. This is not off the top of my head. I'm doing this in some really good districts, really fine districts in California, Washington, and Oregon, and right now, and we're 2 to 3 years into it. And I will allude then to the fact that Rubenstein out of Rutgers, and we have, Jonathan has a electronic copy of a really fine 25-page paper that basically is the first strong data we've got out of a federation district called ABC in California, in which he proves over the last 10 years that when we were in schools building this collaborative culture, now they're out there, they've been out there 20 years, but we have schools where they told us whether it was collaborative or not, and in the places, poor district, where we've got deep collaborative cultures, we're getting improvements of 20 to 25% over the places where we do not, with comparable faculty and kids, we do not have those kinds of cultures. We've never had that data. We had it out of the private sector. We knew what Ford did with collaborative pieces, we knew it, but we've never had it right out of education, at least not to my knowledge, and this is something I do follow. So there's that. I want to stop. We've got a couple of microphones in here, and I'm sure you've got things to say about kind of where I've misjudged this and what you think we've got right. And any reactions would be, I don't think risky. What do I know? All right.
And we do want to use the microphones because we're live streaming this and allowing other people to hear it, and they see your mouth moving but not hear what you have to say without the mic.
Sometimes I do it with the mic, Jonathan. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm real intrigued by the Listen and Learning organization that heals itself, and you mentioned Listen, Learning, and Broadcast.
Yeah.
So, can you speak a little bit more about the broadcasting?
Yeah.
It sounds like the way you presented it, it's almost apologetic if it has to shift its focus. So
okay, so let me talk to that. Far from it, but I do want it to be truth-telling. That is to say, they're listening. I mean, they're doing the work. Let's say they're in their PLCs and we've convinced most of them that we'd like to learn from what they're learning. And we basically, we have a place here where they come up and they tell us what they're struggling with and what isn't and is not working. What I think we do not know how to do is management at the local level, let alone here, we don't know how to say, this is what we are learning when chemistry does this. We have no reflective device that says, when we learn here, we learn. Tell me, you know, I work in high schools all over the country, and I say to the principal, how are the PLCs? He says, great, great. And I say, oh, yeah? He says, yeah. And I say, how do you know? He says, oh, we keep minutes. And I said, oh, great. I said, who sees the minutes? And he looks at me and he says, well, my secretary collects them, and I look at them on occasion. Well, that's a good manager, a good principal. I need him to somehow have a mechanism that he doesn't interpret, but he's sitting there with 4 chairmen of the departments and some other teachers and support staff, and they look at that data, and they ask 2 or 3 leaders from 2 of the PLCs to come in, the one in special ed and so forth, to say, how'd you do this? What are you doing there? And so forth. And when we understand here, the we here has a little electronic 2 pages that says to the whole faculty, you know, these are 4,000 kids in these high schools, they say to the whole faculty, this is what we are learning. Otherwise, we have no way to know what it is we know. We have no way. And we don't own somehow, these are my kids, but I don't care what your kids are doing. That's crazy language, you know, it really is. So you have to keep creating some sort of we, and a broadcast for me isn't simply saying, this is what we are working on, and this is what we are learning, and this is where we are struggling. When they hear that last piece, and they hear it from a union management committee, if you will, and I just mean I need the rep in there and several other people. I need this to be a we that's authentic, all right? I'll say a word about that in a minute, all right? They start to say, oh, there's a narrative here. The broadcast gives you a narrative that schools do not have. Who's in charge of the narrative? Well, if it's a good principal, she is, all right? She kind of, but it's a different kind of narrative when an authentic structure starts talking about where we are and what our work is, all right? And every literature professor, teacher in here knows everybody in this room's got a narrative. And if you don't have one, you make one up, all right? And every teacher, if they're out there, and if you say, how's it going, they give me their narrative of how it's going. And it's their journey, perhaps their department's journey, but it almost never is this journey because they don't know. There's no way of knowing unless you do this work. Narrative gives meaning to my work. If I'm part of a really good school, then I set up and do my work based and included and embedded in that narrative, and it gives my work meaning. If I don't have one, then I just make it up. I went and I taught in a Jesuit prep school. I know it's kind of esoteric place, all right, but we had a narrative that was so powerful that every day you taught with that story in the back of your head, and it informs everything. It's what you're trying to do with your kids. You want them to walk out at 17 or 20 with a narrative of who they are based on who you are, and you want that narrative to drive their action because you're not going to be in the back seat or at the at the steering column. You're not going to be there. They have to have internalized it by then. I think it's everything. We live around campfires, or at least we did for several centuries or eons, and I think we trust the story. And we make it up what we know. Jung had this wonderful, wonderful idea that we all had a middle voice. He basically, we use language like the tape recorder, but the middle voice is really interesting. The middle voice is the voice that says who you are and what you're about. And when you're 3 and you have words, you don't understand that you're not supposed to say the middle voice to everybody. You're supposed to keep it inside. So there's a point at 3 or 4 where you're learning to say, your narrative is yours, not to be broadcast. And then when you're 85, the narrative comes out again, right? And sure enough, you're sharing the internal narrative about who, but it's an internal voice, and if it gets disrupted, if you go through a divorce, you lose a child, that middle voice struggles like mad for a long period of time to make up a new narrative because it didn't expect that in its old narrative. I could go on, but I think telling a story, all worship is telling a story we know 6,000 times again with each other to renew community. We read a piece of the gospel in order to come together. It's the way we come together. And I'm just saying broadcast is certainly not some political kind of apologetic. It's talk about the work truthfully together. Yeah, David. Yeah.
I find this inspiring, but I also am puzzled about how to prevent the board and the centralized organization from being an impediment to the narrative formation that you're talking about. I think some of this is structural. The reality of the media climate and the need to be able to have a narrative that represents 100,000 students, and I think about the elevator speech in my kind of work language, but that's at odds with the deeply personal, and hands-on and crucial narrative that you're talking about. Yeah. And I also don't know how to place some of the vital central functions, specifically funding the capabilities that I think the narrative formation will require in the language that you're using. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure could. Well, I go back to my, about the 10 minutes in, I talked about the narrative here. So let's talk about it for a minute. The danger of very strong leadership in here is that each one has a narrative. And I'll trace the one that I know you're alluding to and that I think is extremely powerful. You have a vision that if you could, all right, kind of get this thing moving in a certain kind of way, you could make, and you say to Tom, take let's get some savings in here, and I can then go out and get savings and monies out here, and I can use all of this to drive the deep improvement of this thing. That's the narrative. It's very powerful, and you're passionate about it, and you're right.
And there's money available.
I know. And so the only piece you're not right about, so the danger is the issue of urgency out here and you creating some speed that the system can't organically handle. So that the first answer is, yeah, you're going to be all over this, and somebody's going to be in here saying, you can talk about it, but you have to have some way to say, and we are at it in the deepest way we know how, and we have to make it real, or it'll be words anyway. I mean, the real dilemma for you is, if you go too fast, as Arnie did, and so forth, you'll lose your vision anyway. All right, this thing won't come with you. But the deeper piece is this narrative here, and we talked some about it. You can't, this narrative has to be about the moral imperative of the growth of academics in these children. That's the story. And it has to be the lead story, and this top team has to say that everywhere, all the time, and act consistently. I don't know how, so you can't, you've got an absolutely splendid business person who's going to go do what it is we've asked him to do. But you can't let that narrative lead the moral enterprise around the education of children, or this thing says, over our dead body. I don't know how else to say it. You can't let one narrative get in front of the other, and especially the wrong one. That narrative is subservient to the fundamental narrative. And so, Donna and that team has got to work constantly to say, are we on the same page? And they are, but you got to tune it every week. You got to say, all right, who's speaking where, when, and how? Because he's really good, and he's going to do it. But he needs to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt our deeper work, both narrative-wise and kind of getting out in front of the parade. That's not easy. But that's her job. Her job is to keep it together such that he can go do it, and do it and a CAO will help because you need the balance and so forth. But in general, this thing has to be one message, and it's got to be around deep learning. I mean, I would work that thing, again, Fulton does some beautiful job. He basically says a complex organization can do one thing every 3 years. Figure out what it is. You give it 15 things, it's a kiss of death. I'm telling you. You got to basically say, are we about deeper learning for these children? What does it mean? Let's go. And then every day, every hour, everybody hits it. Including the business and so forth, so that it's always in context. Brand.
Yeah, there's I think a certain truth that I want to put in the room about this, and I guess a question grows from that, and that is, as we developed the vision, I think there was some shared perspective between the very top, the 3 top circles, that it's sort of like the musical Oklahoma. We've gone about as far as we could go with what we were doing or have been doing in terms of using student achievement data to drive the enterprise and so forth. And we might eke and tweak a little bit more mileage out of that, but you were going to get evolutionary improvement, not revolutionary improvement. And what you really needed was to engage students much more deeply through deeper learning and things that are relevant and meaningful to them. We encountered pushback from the mid-level that said, that's not what we do. That's not how we've gotten to where we are. And doing that would potentially even blind us, in like a pilot with no instruments, and how can we keep moving? So we started to get pushback. So the reaction was to shut that group out. And they were essentially shut out. And then the rest of us designed that, and we have the vision, and the three circles, I think, believe in it. But to drive this, the folks that would be deeply engaged with driving this, I don't think, number one, process-wise, don't feel like they were part of it because they weren't.
Right.
And therefore, number two, I don't think they feel that they own it because they shouldn't.
Right.
And that is a reality. So I don't, does that undermine our ability to make this real, or how do we overcome that? Because we do have that vision now that the three top circles buy into, even if the middle layer is alienated from it fairly deeply.
Yeah, the area superintendents and the principals. That's why I'm here.
Academics, services, and area superintendents, I think.
Well, I thought you didn't describe anything that I didn't try to describe. I think that is what happened, but I don't think that's in some senses. I would argue that precisely the collaborative process that you would begin, the first kind of item that may take you a year is to talk about the fact that you have to survive politically, all right, with test scores and so forth, but you can't get home without deep learning. So you simply have to start mano a mano to say, you tell me and I'll tell you what I think it looks like. Because I think what they're saying at one side is we're going to be, it's a death wish if we don't produce some movement. And the other side of the argument is we'll never get home without doing this deeper whole child. Both is in some senses pie in the sky without the other. It really is. I mean, you can talk forever about whole child. I know you believe in it deeply, but we got to politically stay alive. And so somehow this thing is there's words that say one thing, behavior that kind of says another, act every day kind of, and I think the first activity of that top district leadership team is to talk together. Obama did a wonderful interview in the New York Review of Books with the novelist whose name escapes me right now from Iowa, a double interview, in which she basically was saying to him, and it clearly was dead on his experience, that the country now has basically decided that, I mean, the roots of a democracy are that that we have all sorts of different views, and the roots of a democracy are come to the differences and respect the other and listen and learn and kind of move. And the country right now, to the public narrative, says the other is suspect and evil, and therefore there is nothing for me to hear from them. And in some senses, I'm not saying that that's how the two camps feel, but we need a place to put it together before we can ever make it authentic. It's not real now. All right? The words without some measurement are not real, and the measurement without some deeper vision isn't going to do it either. And let me tell you, one state after another is going to be off this. Maybe Kentucky will hang on for whatever reason, but they're coming off the bandwagon so fast on this testing thing. Maybe they shouldn't, but they are because it went so far. I mean, you may be one of the last four standing at some stage. Yes,
thank you for your presentation, first of all.
Yes.
And I have already told the board before we came up here that I'm still walking under the cloud of the Yum Center on Friday. So what I saw at the Yum Center was a center full of people of all races, of all cultures, of all religions that came together to honor Muhammad Ali. And we talk about Muhammad Ali as a teenager, and a lot of people did not like him then. We don't talk about Muhammad Ali as the boxer, and we don't lay blame, and no one takes credit specifically. So as you talk about your diagram and your circles and the various things that are there, I'm most interested in the education of the children for Jefferson County.
Right.
I'm particularly interested, as we continue to talk about meeting and planning and all of that, how we in fact can come together as a whole with the focus and not be about the business of laying blame, not be about the business of who's better than this and who's better than that. How do we keep our focus on educating our children, working together collectively, which is what I saw on Friday at the Yum Center. So you can't tell me that it's not possible, because I know it is. So would you speak to that, please?
Well, yeah, I'm with you. My dream out of a process like this is that there's only one narrative in here, in Jefferson County. The narrative is these professionals talking about the engagement of those children successfully. Everybody ought to be talking about that. And you want to find a process that allows you to do that, as opposed to whatever we've been after. You know, you want to create a place where all of the dialogue and narrative is about folks saying, we're doing it. This is our work. We're about it. Here's how it's going. We're not doing it here. We're failing here, but we're doing it here. And you just want that being, the narrative has to come from the bottom, from the work, from children learning and adults working with them. And, you know, this is a tough narrative right now. If you're talking about, you know, all of this is blame, your dance around the code of conduct, that's about engagement of children or not. But it comes up in here and it starts becoming a badminton game, you know, and so forth. That's about engagement of children, and we don't have answers to some of it. Let's go get them. But it has to be about those kinds of things. And right now, you know, it's about, you don't want it to be premium pay and code of conduct. That's not what it is. It's about children learning and us being the key to that. I'm with you. It has to be, that has to be the thing we talk about every day, every level.
What?
And I think your strategic plan is that. It's that first piece is very powerful. Nobody's quite there with you verbally yet around deeper learning. Yes, ma'am.
I am new to the school system relatively. I've been here about 5 months. I'm the communications director. But before that, I am a parent of 2 JCPS students. And I think one thing that I've noticed since coming to the district is how siloed we are within our system. We're proud of our individual schools, but we're not a school system. People are proud of the work they do in their building, but JCPS as a whole, it's okay to, you know, take the pot shots or place the blame. What I'm grateful for is the education provided to my children by this system. I have a special needs child who gets an excellent, wonderful education within his building, but also gets excellent services that are provided by this district. And I'm thankful for that. And it shows how our system works. And so I guess I'm interested in your perspective in how do we become the we and not be the silos in 155 different school buildings, but that we acknowledge, you know, just like we need to acknowledge the work in the field, that we acknowledge the work that comes from the district when the field says, I need help.
Yeah. I'm not smart enough to really grapple with a district this size. You have to have some spokespersons that are broad enough and different enough that when they say something together, it catches people's notice. The public narrative is that you're against each other and divided and so forth. So you've got to create a narrative that's real, that you're not. What I would say to the public relations piece and your instinct there is, and I have a certain amount of knowledge here, if you only tell the good stuff, you know this, no, they'll never believe the good stuff. You have to tell the truth for them to believe the good stuff. And so you got to talk about the fact that you've got absolutely splendid schools here, and you've got a large amount of schools that really are failing children, and that's the we. And they got to find a way to talk about that in such a way that they understand your work in it, you're deep involved in it, and you're after it. Then it becomes credible. Our problem is that we look at the thing and say, well, we're not going to tell that, let's go tell the good story. And then they write that off as us polishing it. It's true, but you know, our tendency is to not expose ourselves. I think there's a counterintuitive piece that says you have to tell the whole thing. Now, I don't think we ask you to do it so much, although I certainly think that's part of your job. But it is this job. This group's job is to talk to the internal system about how the tough data. And the data is tough here, as it is in every urban city in the country. And we're losing it a lot of places. You can't lose it. You know, that's the real issue here. And, you know, if you interview the schools here after a while, you just, this thing's all over the place. It's, you know, it's here, and I don't have the breadth that you do around it, but you got to keep saying, these are all our children, and we can't live with this third. We can't live with it, and let's go get, and then you've got to say to the union, I need different seniority rules. I need whatever it is that puts my best teachers there. I need bonus pays. I need teams going in there. Anything anybody's done in the country to go after the really hard places where you need 10 master teachers there. So how will we convince them to go there? Well, LA's done some interesting things. There's some interesting things. It's very tough to send an individual teacher into those places, but people are having enormous success sending in teams of 5 and 6 that get themselves together and say, all right, let's go. Now, there's some bonuses involved and so forth, 3-year stints, but that's when you start saying, oh, this is all of our places. Yeah.
Hi, Pat.
Alan.
I'm just so glad that you're here.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
What I'm also really glad about is that we're in this room together, and that there are also more people to include that are not in this room. And that for me, if we can find ways to truly, deeply coalesce around ends, everyone in this room, people outside this room are committed. The question is, how do we work together with common ends before we just get to means? And that we see if we really coalesce around those things, really listen and learn, and then really look at our language, our processes, our structures, and our protocols on how we engage. And I don't mean just us as adults. How do we do this with kids?
Mm-hmm.
How do they experience their learning? We talk about making kids the center of the universe. Well, do we do it? Do we do it as themselves so that they can have this rich student engaging thing? Because education done to them is different than education that is really they own. And so what I just hope is that I do think that we have, and we're early enough in this process around a vision that I think is a quite compelling one, and then how we can then work together to be able to try to actualize that has to do with ourselves and how we work together in those regards. Yeah. And I think it was just very helpful to see that contrast of how the hierarchical model is so, we just breathe it in with the air, but it may not be that helpful. So,
and
it's
very,
a little bit more.
And don't forget, it's very caring.
Yes,
it just carries
right.
the wrong way.
It carries the wrong way,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think you'll always bring, you'll bring that passion to the room, and I think we expect it from you. I mean that very sincerely. We need it. I'm thinking Marco has to promise not to tell stories of me running guns out of Bolivia into northern Argentina and so forth. He's held his ammunition so far. He and I were both Jesuits in Latin America at some stage. Yes. And in times where that was ordinary procedure, I'm afraid. Yeah. We're probably right on time to kind of head downstairs for your next meeting at 7. Is it? I don't want to shortcut. Yeah.
Let me just say thank you to Dr. Dolan. This was a fantastic thing. I also want to thank the people who saw you and heard you and collectively invited you to come here. I think that was a great call out. And I'm going to close with one tiny but really important point. This was the best refutation of the dominance of PowerPoint that I have ever seen. Anybody who doesn't believe you can communicate eloquently without gorgeous, interactive, slides out of the can, Thank you.
Oh,
This
you
was
and I are
perfect.
the same.
But you are, you know, obviously a born teacher.
Sabotaged this 30 years ago with a piece of software.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we will reconvene downstairs, those who are going to be in the meeting at 7 p.m. So really great.